Welcome to this explainer. Look, if you've ever hung out with someone who just seems to have this absolutely boundless drive and energy, and then later you cross paths with someone who literally can't muster the will to get off the couch, you've probably wondered what exactly is going on there, right? Like, what is the fundamental, invisible engine that actually drives human behavior, desire, and motivation? Well, today, we're diving deep into the fascinating biology behind what makes us tick. Let's see if we can unlock this engine of human desire together.
Now, we've all seen the flashy headlines calling dopamine the pleasure chemical, the magical thing that fires when you eat a slice of cake or win a video game. But we're going to go ahead and bust that myth right out of the gate. As it turns out, dopamine isn't really about the reward at all. It's almost entirely about the pursuit.
To get just a little bit technical for a second, dopamine is what neuroscientists call a neuromodulator. Unlike your standard neurotransmitter that just handles a simple one-to-one conversation between two neurons, a neuromodulator basically broadcasts to the entire nervous system. It's wild to think about, but it literally changes the probability that certain neural circuits will fire while keeping others totally quiet. It is the universal currency for foraging and seeking. It completely dictates your motivation, your drive, and your cravings.
So here is our roadmap for today. 1. The true nature of dopamine. 2. The peak and baseline trap. 3. Spikes, crashes, and addiction. 4. Rewarding the effort itself. And finally 5. Tools for healthy dopamine.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the true nature of dopamine, the evolutionary engine of human survival.
To really wrap our heads around our modern neurobiology, we have to look back at how our species actually survived. Imagine you're a forager, right? It's 10,000 years ago. You wake up, look around, and realize you are totally out of food and water. You need energy. That is step 1. In step 2, dopamine is the exact mechanism that drives you to go out and look. You hunt, you seek, and finally in step 3, you find the reward, a fresh meal. Since you couldn't just open a fridge back then, getting that meal triggers a massive dopamine release. But here is the absolute genius evolutionary trick. In step 4, your dopamine doesn't just stay high, it drops. And it actually drops to a level below where you started. Why? Well, because if you just stayed perfectly satisfied, you'd sit there and starve eventually. The whole system was meticulously designed to keep you moving.
Moving on to Section 2, the peak and baseline trap. This is all about the hidden cost of experiencing massive rewards.
So, why exactly does every massive high carry this biological tax? In your brain, dopamine is stored in synaptic vesicles. Think of them like tiny, microscopic little bubbles. When you hit a huge high, these bubbles basically vomit dopamine out into your system. This is called your readily releasable pool. If you do something that triggers a massive dopamine dump, you are literally emptying out your available pool of motivation. Your baseline absolutely crashes afterward, because physically, the dopamine is simply no longer there to be released.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 3, spikes, crashes, and addiction. Let's talk about how modern superstimuli completely hijack this ancient hardware.
We're basically walking around with ancient brains in a world that is just overflowing with superstimuli. When you break down the scale of these chemical and behavioral spikes, it's pretty staggering. Eating a piece of chocolate, that increases your dopamine baseline about 1.5 times. Having sex or doing a workout you genuinely love will double it, a solid 2x increase. But then you look at illicit drugs like amphetamines. Those trigger a massive 10-time spike above your baseline. And there's a fascinating study from 2003 showing that these gigantic peaks from things like amphetamines and cocaine actually limit structural neuroplasticity in the brain. Basically, these unnatural spikes lock the brain out of being able to learn or positively rewire itself for a while. It's exactly why you feel so incredibly foggy and unmotivated the day after a highly stimulating weekend.
So how on earth do we avoid these crashes while still keeping our drive alive? The secret is intermittent reward schedules. This taps into something called dopamine reward prediction error. When we don't know exactly when a reward is coming or how big it's going to be, our motivation literally skyrockets. It's the exact same psychology that casinos use to keep you glued to a slot machine, or that social media apps use to keep you endlessly scrolling. But the cool thing is, you can actually use this defensively in your own life to stay highly motivated without constantly draining your dopamine bank.
That takes us to Section 4, rewarding the effort itself and cultivating the ultimate growth mindset.
Here's where it gets empowering. Your logical thinking brain, your prefrontal cortex, can step in and consciously assign positive meaning to friction and hard work. There's this wildly famous experiment from a Stanford nursery school that proves this perfectly. Researchers found kids who just intrinsically loved to draw. They drew for the pure, simple joy of it. Then the researchers started giving them an extrinsic reward, a shiny gold star for every drawing. After a while, they suddenly stopped giving out the stars. And guess what happened? The kids completely stopped drawing. The external reward had retroactively destroyed their intrinsic pleasure in the activity. When we focus purely on the shiny reward at the finish line, we actually disconnect the neural circuits that would have naturally given us pleasure during the work itself.
Which brings us to this absolutely crucial, kind of counterintuitive rule. Do not artificially spike your dopamine before you do something hard, and definitely don't rely on massive spikes immediately after. You literally have to use your prefrontal cortex to convince yourself that the painful effort is the reward. I know, it sounds super tough, but by repeatedly telling yourself, I'm choosing to do this, and I love the friction, you will eventually start releasing dopamine from the challenge itself. Over time, that kind of relentless discipline just becomes a reflex.
And finally, Section 5, Tools for Healthy Dopamine. Let's look at some science-backed protocols to elevate your baseline safely.
Okay, this specific metric absolutely blew me away when I saw the data. 2.5 times. Studies show that exposing yourself to cold water, we're talking immersing yourself in 50 to 60 degree Fahrenheit water, can safely elevate your dopamine levels up to 2.5 times above your baseline. But here's the magic part. Unlike drugs that give you a vicious spike and a devastating crash, the dopamine release from cold water is this slow, sustained rise. It actually keeps your baseline elevated for hours afterward, leaving you with this profound, lingering sense of calm and sharp focus. Now, what about the pharmacological side of things? There are some really fascinating but admittedly tricky options here. Yerba mate is fantastic. Not only does it give you a clean caffeine hit, but it actually upregulates your dopamine receptors and acts as a neuroprotectant for your dopamine pathways. But, and this is a big but, we have to be extremely careful with supplements like L-tyrosine. It's an amino acid precursor, and taking 500 to 1,000 milligrams will definitely elevate your alertness. But beware, because it absolutely will cause a dopamine crash later. Plus, it should be totally avoided by anyone with a pre-existing dopaminergic condition, like bipolar disorder or severe anxiety. Finally, if you need to do some intense deep work, there is PEA. When paired with alpha-GPC, it can give you a very sharp, tightly regulated 30 to 45-minute window of just laser focus. On the clinical side, you have prescription medications like Wellbutrin. This actively increases both dopamine and norepinephrine, and psychiatrists often use it to treat depression specifically to bypass the usual side effects of traditional SSRIs. But taking a step back from supplements and prescriptions for a second, I really want to highlight something incredibly foundational. Healthy, close, social connections are absolutely essential for stimulating and maintaining your dopamine pathways. At our core, we are social creatures, and our neurobiology heavily relies on that human connection to thrive. If there is one singular, core philosophy I want you to take away from all this research, it's that your dopamine pathways aren't just something happening to you. They are entirely in your control. The ultimate locus of control here is realizing that your past dopamine levels dictate today's baseline, and the choices you make today, how you handle your rewards, how you manage your effort, and how you regulate those spikes will completely determine your drive for the weeks to come.
Your baseline is yours to protect and yours to elevate. So I want to leave you with this final thought. Now that you actually understand the underlying biology of your motivation, and you know for a fact that you can train your brain to see effort as its own reward, how are you going to approach your very next difficult task? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I genuinely hope you use this knowledge to drive yourself forward.